Welcome to Pyrography Made Easy. I'm Brenda. In this episode, I'm going to explain my zigzag burn stroke method that I use to create short fur. I will explain what zigzags are and the principles for using them. Plus, I will explain how to modify the zigzags to create different looks in the fur. So let's get started. A zigzag is literally a line burned in a back and forth or zigzag motion. I refer to each individual zigzag as a zigzag burst. Each burst has between 3 to 7 lines on it. You want to vary the number of lines and how long the lines are in each burst. Also, vary the distance or the gap between the lines in the burst. Now I'm starting to burn a zigzag patch, which is simply a group of zigzag bursts. The important thing is to vary where you start each burst in the patch. Seriously, it is really important to vary the starting point of each zigzag. This is one of the key components to creating realistic fur using my zigzag method. What you absolutely do not want to do is burn long rows or bands of zigzags. This does not even remotely look like fur, so avoid doing this. Don't burn bands or rows of zigzags. In this portion of the demo, I am using the flat of the shader to burn zigzags. Notice how wide or thick the lines are on each zigzag. To me, the lines are too thick to look like hair. Now I've angled the pin tip so that I am using just the razor edge of it at the end. The lines are much thinner and a lot closer to looking like hair. In addition to using the razor edge of the pin tip, it is also important to use a light hand pressure when burning. The razor edge of the tip tends to dig into the wood surface, so using a light hand pressure will help minimize this from happening. For this zigzag patch, I am using a heavy hand pressure. And I'll be honest, I'm having problems burning more than 1 or 2 lines on each burst. While it's probably hard to see on the screen, the pin tip is really digging deep into the wood surface, and that is what's preventing me from really burning good zigzag bursts. I'm going to add a second layer of zigzags to the patches. This patch was created using light hand pressure, and it's the same pressure I'm using for the second layer on it. And I'm not experiencing any difficulties during this burn process. I'm having a lot of difficulty adding a second layer to this patch. I'm not adding any additional texture or tonal depth because the pin tip keeps falling into the deep lines from the first burn. Here's a comparison of the two burns. The left burn, created using heavy pressure, doesn't look very good. This portion of the demo I would consider as a realistic example of zigzag burns. I'm using light pressure, and I'm just using the razor edge of the shader to burn the lines. As a result, the lines are nice and thin. Each zigzag burst starts in a different spot. Also, the number of lines and the space between the lines varies, as does the length of the lines in each burst. When I add a second layer of zigzags, the overall color of the patch increases, but there is still a lot of tonal variation. Each layer of zigzags adds to the texture and the tonal depth of the patch, and this is what helps create that realistic fur look. I want to point out that the second layer of zigzags is burned just like the first. So each burst needs to start in a different spot. You need to vary the number of lines in each burst, and also vary the distance between the lines and how long the lines are in each burst. These rules apply to every single layer that you do on your patch. Usually I will burn 3 to 5 layers of zigzags on a patch of fur. The last thing I want to cover is the need to burn zigzags in the growth direction of the fur. For this eye example, you will not get realistic results if the zigzags were all burned in the same direction. As the fur changes direction, you need to angle the zigzag burst to match that direction. You start gradual, and as you work your way further in the new direction, you continue to change the angle to match it. This burn started out vertical when I was burning on the nose, but the direction changed to an almost horizontal angle when I was working above the eye. So let's repeat this process and work on the under part of the eye. Again, as I work on the nose area, the burn direction is almost vertical. But once I head towards the eye, the angle changes, slanting slightly to the left. As I work along the lower portion of the eye, the burn angle continues to increase to match the fur growth direction. At the left corner of the eye, the zigzags are burning in an almost horizontal direction. When you are working on fur, pay close attention to the direction the fur is growing and make sure your burn strokes match that direction. To contour or give shape to an area, just reburn as needed. In this example, I am reburning along the right corner of the eye. This makes the corner look recessed or sunken down from the fur on the nose. Make sure when reburning that all of the strokes continue to follow the growth direction of the fur. Okay, so here are my last tips to help you get good burn results. First, make sure your board is ultra smooth. Sand it, wet it, let it dry, sand it again. Secondly, use a light hand pressure. The pen tip is already going to dig into the wood, so using a hard or heavy hand pressure is not going to make that any better. And lastly, keep the heat set between low and medium. The higher the heat, the more the pen wants to dig into the wood. Modifying zigzags. Example 1. Most animals do not have a uniform layer of fur. Generally speaking, the fur on the face is much shorter than the fur on the body. When working on really short fur, decrease the height of the zigzag strokes. As I am working on the nose fur, I am using the corner of the shader and barely moving my hand. The corner of the shader reduces the amount of metal in contact with the wood, and this helps you get shorter lines. That combined with reducing my hand movement produces really short zigzags. Compare my hand movement and these two side-by-side video segments. Notice how little my hand is moving in the video on the left. Also notice how short the burn strokes are. My hand movements are much bigger in the video on the right, and the zigzags are larger or taller in height. Other than modifying the height of the zigzags for really short fur, the guidelines I explained in the demo portion of this video still apply. So vary the starting point, the width, the number of lines, and the gaps between the lines on the zigzag bursts. It takes a number of zigzag layers to create highly realistic fur. I'm not going to do that with this demonstration. Instead, I just wanted to show how modifying the height of the zigzags changes how the fur looks. When reburning, make sure to use the same burn stroke height for the area. In areas that are in shadows or have slight markings, I slow down my hand speed to get a darker burn result, and I reburn over the area more often to build up the color. Here is the final comparison photo. You can see the short fur along the nose and the longer fur on the forehead. Example 2. Another way to modify zigzags is to greatly reduce the gap between the lines. The less gap there is, the darker the zigzag will appear. With this black colored fur, I have eliminated most of the gaps between the lines. Plus, when I reburn over the area, I am deliberately trying to burn over the gaps created from the first layer. I want just enough gaps so that the viewer can tell that this is fur. The fur on this cat has really short fur around the front of the face, just like the previous cat did. And, just like the previous cat, the fur gets longer as you near the forehead. So this means that really short zigzags need to be burned around the face and normal-sized zigzags on the forehead. Another thing I want to talk about are the areas of reflected light on the fur. In those areas, I burn zigzags with the normal gap or space between the lines. So let's recap. Use short zigzags when burning really short fur like that found on the nose and under the eyes. Use normal-sized zigzags for the rest of the fur, like that found on the forehead. With areas that are really dark, reduce the gap between the lines on the zigzags and burn them closer together. Also, you can reduce your hand speed to get even darker burn results. On the areas of reflected light, burn zigzags with a normal gap space between the lines. Some of you might be wondering why I didn't burn the fur to a solid or uniform black color like the reference photo shows. The reason is that I do not think it would convey the sense of fur very well in the artwork. Photos do not always capture the details of the subject well, and as artists, we can choose when to make alterations to our work. If someone asked me to create artwork of this cat, I would either ask for a better picture or do what I am currently doing, giving the fur more detail than the reference photo shows. When I create detail that isn't on the reference photo, I use other examples to help me. The fur on the black cat isn't much different than the gray cat I just did. I am using the gray cat to determine the fur growth direction and the general shadow placement. Based on that, I will make the fur on either side of the nose next to the eyes darker than the nearby fur. I will change the direction I burn the fur so that it follows the arch or upper contours of the eye. The major difference between the black and gray cats is the color and the forehead highlight and markings. The black cat does not have any markings, but it has reflected light on its forehead. So this will be what I mimic. What I am doing with the black cat are modifications that you can easily do too. Here is the cat, and yes, it needs to be darkened up, but I felt that what I did was enough for this demonstration. Example 3. The next example is an orange-colored cat that also has a number of face markings. Overall, the cat is not very dark in color. I'm going to start the cat like normal and burn over the pencil marks so that they can be erased. There is nothing unique or unusual with this process. It is simply burning zigzags over the pencil marks which are drawn in the fur growth direction. With the lines mostly burned over, let me explain the next zigzag modification. With this modification, you increase the gap between the lines on the zigzag to produce a lighter colored burn result. If you also increase your hand speed, you will get an even lighter colored burn result. Like the other two examples, I shorten the height of the burn stroke when working on really short face fur. I also reburn over the fur several times, but with this lighter colored cat, I incorporate large gaps between the lines on the zigzags for each layer. When burning in the dark orange markings, I do reduce the gap to get darker results. This cat has white markings on it. I personally think you should always burn over the white fur to give it some texture. Otherwise, to me, it looks like you forgot to burn it in. When burning over the white fur, really increase the gap between the lines and the zigzags. You want the color to stay in the light to medium tan range. It might be easier to burn a few single lines instead of zigzags on the white fur. Try both methods to see which one works best for you. Like I said before, it is just to give it a little texture. There was a point in the video where I burn over the markings and they disappear. They end up looking like the same color as the rest of the fur. But after I am done reburning over the rest of the fur, the white markings become more noticeable or pronounced. The reason is that I increase the contrast between the white markings and the rest of the fur. Light colors look brighter when dark colors are next to them. Here's the orange cat, and it has a lot more tonal or color variation than the previous two cats. This is controlled by reburning and zigzag modifications. Example 4. With this cat, we can use all of the modifications that I've talked about so far. With the dark markings on the forehead, decrease the gap between the lines on the zigzags. As always, burn in the fur growth direction. Notice the angle I'm burning in the fur. It slants diagonally. We see the other marking at a different angle, so the slant changes on either side of it. When burning the center of the marking, burn zigzags that match the direction the edges were burned in. Also, the edges of the markings should be jagged. Markings do not have crisp lines or edges around them. I have sped up the video while I'm burning in the dark markings, as there isn't anything more to say about them. The fur on the upper portion of the nose is very short, so reduce the height of the burn stroke. Also, the fur is black and white in color. So as you fill the area with short zigzags, leave large gaps between the lines on the zigzags. Also, leave some gaps between the zigzag bursts. The unique modification for this cat has nothing to do with zigzags. Instead, it is how I add dark specks to the fur. This modification is the last thing that should be done, so I'm going to burn 2 layers of zigzags on the nose to get the area to its final color. Use the razor edge of the shader and tap it randomly in the area. This will create very short, dark lines or dashes. Make sure to preserve these small white specks in the area. The lines or dashes should be dark brown or black in color. If you are not achieving that, then either hold the pen tip in place for a fraction of a second or turn up the heat on your burner just a little. To get the shortest burn results, have as little of the pen tip in contact with the wood as possible. Also, do not move your hand once the pen tip is in contact with the wood. Allow the pen tip to touch the wood, then lift it straight up. On the left is how the area looked before the extremely short dashes were burned on. The image on the right is how it looked after I was done. At this point, there isn't anything unique or different with this cat that we haven't already covered with the previous cats. Let's recap the information. When burning really short fur, make sure to decrease the height of your zigzag burn stroke. When burning really dark fur, decrease the gap between the lines on each zigzag. Also, you can decrease how fast you move your hand to get even darker burn results. When burning pale or white fur, increase the gap between the lines on each zigzag. And you can increase how fast you move your hand to get even lighter burn results. Use a light hand pressure when burning. This will help prevent the razor edge of the pen tip from sinking into the wood. Make sure you sand your board thoroughly before burning. I also highly recommend getting the board wet, allowing it to dry, and then sanding it again. This produces an ultra-smooth board, and the smoother the board is, the better the burn results will be. Vary where you start each zigzag. Alter the number of lines, the width, and the height of each zigzag. Always burn in the fur growth direction. Try to keep the heat set on your burner just to the point where you get a medium to dark tan burn result. This will allow you to burn more layers of zigzags without the fur getting too dark. Reburning is your friend. You will get more realistic results by applying additional layers of zigzags. The very last thing we need to do with this cat is apply a layer of dark lines randomly over the fur. The length of the lines should match the length of the fur in the area. So the lines on top of the head should be longer in length than those around the nose. Also, you can use these lines to contour or give shape to the fur. On the bridge of the nose, I applied more tiny dashes to darken up the right side and make it look recessed or sunken in. Here is another before and after picture to show how the dark lines change the look of the fur. Here's how the last example turned out. It's not perfect, but few things are. Pen tip testing. The last thing I want to mention is that you should test out different pen tips to see what kind of burn results you can get. Some pen tips might be easier to use to get the results that you want. Others might be great for creating different looks in the fur. Plus, you can use different pin tip sizes to help you create different lengths of fur. For example, using a large shader makes it easier to burn much taller zigzags, and this will give you longer looking fur. I also recommend testing out how the results look when burned in different directions. Another thing to try is holding your hand at a different angle. Basically, just play around and experiment with the pin tips. Some of the best textures I've discovered happened when I was experimenting to see what I could get the pin tip to do. With the raccoon in my Raspberry Bandit artwork, I was able to use the large E spade shader to create the longer and mostly straight fur on the side of the body. I also used that same shader to create some of the longer fur on the wolf. Another pin tip I found helpful was the LSS shader. I used it to create some of the long, softer looking fur on the wolf. So I highly recommend that you experiment with the pin tips that you have to see what sort of textures you can create. Well, that's it for this episode. On my website, Pyrography Made Easy, I have the written version of this tutorial along with all of the reference material. Well, thank you for watching my video, and I will see you next week.